When we upload fonts to Webflow, we can see the weights we're using. So we have a 400, 600, and 700 weight. Now to set our type styles, we can open our variables. We'll scroll down to the bottom and look for the font folder. So here we have the primary family used throughout our whole site. We'll switch that to the font we just uploaded. And the weights we're going to use with that family is a 400, a 600, and a 700 weight. And if we ever want to change this, we only had to change it in one place, and it will update for all headings, text styles that we're referencing that weight. Now, in this design, we have two font families, so I'm going to create another one here, and I'll call this secondary family. And this family is for the headings. I'll switch that to impact. We also need to save the weight we're going to use with this family. So we'll create a size here, and we'll call this secondary, and I'll call this medium. Now I'll just pull from the font weight folder, make this be a 600 weight. Now, even though these two just happen to match right now, we still want a second variable for the impact. That way, if we ever want to switch this, we can switch the impact's weight without switching the main font's weight. So we want to keep those saved as separate variables. Now, when going set up our design, if we had a negative 3% letter spacing in Figma, that converts to negative 0.3 EM in Webflow. And we would just want to add in all the different letter spacing values we were using in our design. So I could create a size here. If we had a negative 6%, that's negative 0.6 EM. And we would name the variable that, and we'd set its value to match. Now, if we later on decide we want to maybe loosen up this letter spacing a bit, we can actually just change its value here, and we can also rename the variable to match. And then any headings or elements that were using this value will all update from just changing it in one place. We also want to add all the line height values we were using in our design. And the same thing, if we ever want to update this, we would rename the variable, change its value, and all elements that we're referencing this variable will change. Now we have a couple different text styles. This text main is applied to the body, and it's our main sort of font style. It has a 1 rem font size. We can set that to whatever we want. The font family is our primary family coming from this folder here, and the weight we're applying to it is our primary regular, which is set right here. And for the line height, we can choose anything from our line height folder. We can also detach this if we want to do a one-off custom sort of style, but it's best to try and keep these linked if possible. For the letter spacing, we can choose anything from the letter spacing, and text transform, we can make it all uppercase or anything we want there. And for the text small style, it's pretty much linked to the same styles there as well. And the text large is pretty much the same thing also, just with a different font size for now. Now for the headings, we can always tweak each of these individually, but there's also a folder up top for all headings. So in this case, I want to quickly change the font family applied to all headings. So I'll switch that over to the impact family. And then I want to quickly change the weight I'm using, and I'll switch that over to impact's weight. And I can change the default line height. That should apply to most of my headings here. I can change the default letter spacing, and in this case, I'm even going to want all my headings to be uppercase by default. Now, we'll notice that our display, our H1, they're all referencing that all heading, font family, weight, letter spacing, but we can always override that. So if we want our H1 not to reference all headings, but use its own letter spacing instead, we can just go to the letter spacing folder and just choose a different value here and to unlink it from all headings. But I'm going to keep that linked in this case. And what you'll notice is for some of our smaller sort of heading styles like this H5, it starts to unlink from all headings and use its own line height, its own letter spacing, just because the font size is smaller, so that stuff needs to increase. But we can change that for any of our headings. This all headings is just like a quick way to change some of those global styles. Now, by making those quick changes, all our headings are using the impact font. They're all caps. And then we have our body copy, large, main, and small. And if we ever want to, these are all regular right now. If we want to change the weight on a particular text element, we have these weight utilities. So I could add maybe a U weight bold, and that's going to make it bold. And that's referencing inside of the font family folder, the primary bold weight. Now we've added a secondary family here, so we're going to need a utility for that weight. So we can duplicate this card. We'll call this U weight and we'll call it secondary, and this is medium. But if we had multiple weights we were using with that secondary family, we could have a secondary bold, secondary regular, and I'll go ahead and duplicate this utility and I'll set it to match. We'll call this secondary medium, and we want to change inside this, it's in the font folder. We want this to link to the secondary medium sort of weight that we created. And if we had multiple of these, like a secondary bold or a secondary regular, anytime we're using our secondary family, we could stack those utilities on top to override its weight. Now, one thing we'll notice if we remove this class is all of our heading tags have no styles by default. That means instead of having to apply the class always directly to a heading, we could apply the class to the parent of the heading if we'd like, and it will just receive the font styles from its parent. The first reason for this is to make sure every heading gets a custom component class with a utility class on top. Now that we have multiple of these style guide title elements throughout this page, if we later decide we want to change all of them to an H1 instead of H2 style, all we have to do is rename the stacked class, and that's going to update across every single one of these title elements. Now, if these titles just had a default style and we forgot to apply the utility, then we would lose that ability to rename the stacked class and change all of their styles globally. In Lumos, we use rich text elements for all of our text because this allows us to bold, italicize, or even make certain words a link inside of a component. If we use a regular heading element, we lose all those options when linking it to a component field. Now, if all of our headings had default styles on their tags, then the font size would be based on the tag we chose for that component. So we might make this an H3 and notice how the font size changes. That's not quite what we want. If we want to be able to set the font size based on the section, I might add a U text and set H1 here, but it doesn't affect the text at all if that heading had a default style attached to its tag. So because our headings don't actually have these default styles on their tags, we're able to adjust the font size for that section freely, and that applies specifically to this component regardless of which tag is inside our rich text. Ultimately, tags are meant for search engines and screen readers, while font size is a design choice that can be independent of that. So separating the functionality from the style has a lot of benefits that can really improve our builds. Now, if for whatever reason we need those default styles, like maybe any long form content like an article or privacy policy, we can add a utility of U rich text, and that just styles all H1 headings to have the H1 tag styling, and they have some default top and bottom margin. All of the tags are getting their default stylings. The unordered lists get their bullet points back, whereas before they were completely cleared. And so all of those default styles just come back. We can even apply this to a regular div. So here we have a regular H1 heading and some paragraph elements. And if we apply that same U-rich text class to a div, then that heading inside and those paragraphs automatically get their default styles with their default margins, and it just trims the top margin from first element and bottom margin from last element. Now, if we want to create some kind of override, we can just maybe detach this text transform, and then we can set it to whatever style we want here. Now, for font weight, we don't want to detach that because we lose the ability to globally update that weight if we ever want to change it. So we want to make sure this is always linked to a variable. We could either reference that variable directly. So in the font folder, we can grab maybe a secondary regular if we had that variable saved. And that way we could just override the weight we're using on this particular instance. And these changes we're making here are only affecting the hero title with view display. It's not affecting the main display class. Another option we have for weight is just to stack the U weight utility and just apply it that way. Like mentioned in our size lesson, these font sizes here, like our display font size, are linked to the adaptive size folder, so they automatically reduce on each breakpoint. If we want greater control over how this shrinks on a certain breakpoint, we can override an individual style, like our display style. And to do that, we can just open our custom code and open the responsive embed, and either on portrait or landscape or any breakpoint we want here, we could grab maybe this display and font size, and we could change that to be maybe 3.5 rem instead. And if we save that, now on tablet breakpoint, we've overridden the font size of the display here. And for even greater control, we can use the Lumos Fluid Builder to make font sizes, spacing, and all our sizes throughout the site responsive.